Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahalbarra. He ruled the Philippines with an iron fist for 20 years before being overthrown in a people power uprising. Ferdinand Marcos died in exile 27 years ago, but the former president is continuing to cause controversy. Many Filipinos are outraged by the secret burial of his body last week in the hero's cemetery. They say his last resting place is an insult to the thousands of Filipinos who were tortured or killed during his corrupt dictatorship. And they're furious at the current president, Rodrigo Duterte, for keeping his election promise to the Marcos family. Our reporter Jamila Alindugan is with one of the largest so-called Day of Rage protests in the Lunita Park in the capital, Manila.
Protesters call this a night of rage, a Black Friday protest. They say against what they call is the audacity of the Marcos family, the deliberate attempt to revise history, and the betrayal of President Duterte. Exactly a week ago, former President Ferdinand Marcos was buried at the Heroes Cemetery during a secret ceremony that was planned with the Philippine National Police, with the Philippine military, with the blessing of President Rodrigo Duterte. Now, President Duterte admits that, in fact, this is a campaign promise fulfilled, that he says the burial of the former dictator at the Heroes Cemetery means closure for the country. He told protesters that they have to learn how to deal with their grief. But for the thousands of students here, they say there will be no let-up. They say that even though the former president has been buried at the Heroes Cemetery, they will fight, they say, against the continuing attempt to revise history. Majority of the protesters here come from different parts of Metro Manila. More than 90% of them are students. They said that the regime of former President Ferdinand Marcos has destroyed institutions. It took the Philippine military decades before it was able to recover. Over 100,000 people have been either killed, tortured, and jailed during his regime, that the Marcoses are also accused of siphoning off more than $10 billion of government funds. The burial of the former president remains to be one of the most divisive issues in recent Philippine history. And the protest here shows no sign of slowing down.
27 years after he died in exile, the Marcos legacy remains controversial. Here's why. He ruled under martial law for most of his 20 years in power. His dictatorial regime is accused of widespread human rights abuses, including killing 3,000 opponents and torturing tens of thousands of others. A government commission estimates the Marcos family and their allies stole $10 billion from Filipinos. Marcos supporters say the Philippines benefited from his rule, including improved security and grand infrastructure projects. Now let's bring in our guests. Joining us from the demonstration in Manila is Renato Reyes, Secretary General of Bayan, which translates as the new patriotic alliance that was established in 1985 to oppose the government of Ferdinand Marcos. Joining us by Skype from Los Baños, Laguna, just outside Manila, we have Antonio Contreras, Professor of Politics at De La Salle University. And also from Manila, we have Richard Heydarian, Political Analyst and International Affairs columnist. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start by asking Mr. Renato Reyes this. Mr. Renato, why did you take to the streets to denounce the decision to grant Marcos a hero's burial?
This is a protest exactly happening a week after the burial, the surprise burial of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos. And a lot of people here, if you will notice, they're young people. So there are several generations detached from what happened during martial law, during the dictatorship. Yet they are here protesting because they fear that this whole exercise of burying Marcos in the libingan ng mga bayani in a hero's burial is going to whitewash history and pave the way for the return of the heirs of the dictator to power. So it's something that they do not accept. It's something that we will fight. We may lose the legal battle, but we will definitely not lose the fight in upholding the judgment of history.
Mr. Antonio Contreras, you've listened to what Reyes was basically saying, that the fight will continue and that the burial is an attempt to whitewash the legacy of a man who has been accused of torturing thousands of people.
Well, first of all, let me just clarify that even if President Duterte was the one who initially said that the burial of former President Marcos can be now be pushed through at the libingan ng mga bayani, it was the Supreme Court of the Philippines who gave the go signal. It was cleared by the Supreme Court, so that's one thing that should be clarified. And the number two, it should also be clarified that what was given was not a hero's burial, but just the burial of a soldier. So even if the name of the libingan ng mga bayani has a bayani, which means hero in Tagalog, it was not actually a hero's burial, because for me and for many people, and I think even to the protesters, Marcos will never become a hero. He is not a hero. He was the architect of martial law. But let us clarify that this is an issue that is a matter of law. The country is divided. You're correct. It's a very divisive issue. And so in matters like this, where there is division, the final arbiter would be the Supreme Court. And the court spoke.
All right.
So we have to abide by it. And on the issue of the justice, the truth that we need to look for, definitely Marcos's death will not solve that. Even if Marcos was not buried at the libingan ng mga bayani, it will not be solved. What will really serve the interest of justice and truth is to really once and for all have an accounting of the culpability of people. I think what really stopped the search for truth and justice is when we had this grand narrative that Marcos was the only one responsible for all the torture, death.
Mr. Contreras,
there were many people who did that for 20, 30 years, and many of them are still alive.
We will go into details into this particular, but let me include Mr. Haydarian. Mr. Haydarian, Marcos Contreras was basically saying that the Supreme Court dismissed petitions to block the burial, and therefore this should happen. However, do you agree with the decision made by the Supreme Court?
Well, again, to begin with, we have to be very fair that President Duterte was very clear from the period of campaign, his presidential campaign, that if he wins, he's going to bury Marcos in the Cemetery of National Heroes. And the Supreme Court also cleared that recently. And of course, surveys over the past 2 decades show that majority of Filipinos, around 60% of Filipinos, support the burial of Marcos as in the Cemetery of National Heroes. Now, we can debate whether he was technically buried as a national hero or not, but the grounds for you to be buried in that specific cemetery is that you have to be a president and soldier, but importantly, you have to be worthy of inspiration and emulation for these generations and the generations to be born. That is what the law says very clearly. And I think this is where the protests come into picture, because they believe, regardless of the technicalities and the legal basis for his burial in that cemetery, there is nothing with the Marcos regime that is worthy of inspiration and emulation by these generations and the generations to come. I think that is really the bone of contention here. It's a symbolic value of having a former dictator who is responsible allegedly for massive human rights violations and huge economic damage to the country. I mean, $28 billion of debt was left behind by that dictatorship. To have that person to be buried, and the way he was buried last week, he was buried for many people in a surreptitious and sneaky way. There was no update given to the people. In fact, the President Duterte himself says that he was not aware that Marcos was just buried quite sneakily last Friday. So this is the reason why we see a lot of outrage on the streets right now from people across the generations and across the country.
Let me go back to Renato Reyes. I hope you hear me clearly now, Mr. Renato. Mr. Renato, what's next for your movement? Are you going to be confined to the streets, or are you planning now a next move?
There's still some legal actions that we plan to take next week, starting Monday. We hope to file a motion for reconsideration regarding the case that we brought to the Supreme Court blocking the burial. We also plan to undertake other demonstrations and continuing education. And the focus now is to ensure that the young people, especially those who have involved themselves in mobilizations, that they would learn what really happened during the martial law period, and that they would never forget the bitter lessons of our history. So that's the only thing we think that can stand in the way of a full-blown Marcos restoration and the return of the Marcoses to Malacanang. This is no longer just a simple legal issue. There is so much at stake here. What's at stake is the judgment of history. What's at stake is the possibility that the heirs of the dictator can actually go back to power in Malacanang.
In allowing Marcos to be given a hero's burial, the current president, Rodrigo Duterte, kept a promise made during his election campaign. Duterte defended his decision during a trip to Peru last week.
Liability is always personal. That's a principle of law. And me, I was just being legalistic about it. President Marcos was a president for so long, and he was a soldier. So that's about it. Whether or not he performed worse or better, there's no study, there's no movie about it.
Mr. Contreras, let me ask you this. By giving Marcos a hero's burial, do you think that Duterte was trying to genuinely honor his legacy or just to broaden the base of his support nationwide?
I'd like to again correct that he wasn't given a hero's burial. Even the Supreme Court didn't say that he's a hero. And I know we can debate until our face turn blue. We are a modern society. We are a republic. We are a democratic state. At least that's what we label ourselves. And in the final analysis, in these divisive times, the arbiter would be the law. And I think the remedy now is that it has been mooted, and already the motion for reconsideration is no longer available. So if we want to pursue justice, then I think it's about time that all the sectors should really come up with, even if it's too late, probably a truth commission, a martial law crimes commission, that will really once and for all identify the culpabilities of people beyond indemnifying the victims, because there is already a law that gives them some payment. I think what is more important is to really find out who are the people behind. Because, it's very convenient to say that Marcos was the architect of martial law. That's true. That's a historical fact. But to attribute to him the culpability for every torture, for every murder, for every rape,
Mr. Contreras,
would be hard to believe. So I think what we should do is we should really have a legal basis for that. And the best way is to file cases, investigate. There are still survivors of torture and rape that can be asked. Who are these people?
I get
them to justice.
Sure, I get your point. Mr. Haidarian, Contreras is saying that let's establish facts, let's set up committees to revisit the history and decide for themselves about the legacy of Ferdinand Marcos. Something similar to the reconciliation committees and so on and so forth. Do you agree with this?
Yeah, I think just like the example of Chile, Argentina, a lot of countries in Latin America who in the 1970s also went through a period of military dictatorship or civilian dictatorship, I think the Philippines should also have created a Justice, Truth and Reconciliation Commission to make sure that there's a commensurate dispensation of justice, not only to the Marcoses, but everyone who was in one way or another responsible for the atrocities or allegations of atrocities during that time. So I think many supporters of Marcos believe that he's being unfairly blamed for everything. But I think as President Truman made it very clear in the mid-20th century, the buck stops with the president. At the end of the day, the president is called the commander-in-chief for a reason. So if you're the president, you cannot say that just because other people, your subordinates, help you in implementing it, therefore you can wash off your hands. So while it's correct to say that Marcos alone was not responsible for allegations of atrocities and other kind of crimes during the martial law period, that doesn't wash off the hands of the leader of the country, who was the president, and that's very clear in the Constitution. That's one thing we have to really keep in mind.
Mr. Contreras, let me ask you this. Do you believe that the left in the Philippines is trying to hijack the whole narrative about the legacy of Marcos by saying that this has been someone who killed thousands of people, destroyed the economy, and so on and so forth?
The whole narrative of martial law seems to be simplified. That is a problem. It's not a question of hijacking. It's not even a question of distorting it. It's a question of just simplifying it. The period is so complex. There are many actors. Now we talk about command responsibility. Of course, nobody is questioning the fact that Marcos was in command. But that doesn't wash in terms of who is going to be held accountable. He has already been held accountable for a long, long time. And he's dead. But how do we move on from here? His death doesn't seem to end it. It's still dividing us. But I think what is going to really end it is the truth. And I will still, I think, persist on the idea, because we had 30 years after Marcos and no single soul has been convicted. But they're saying there are 3,000 of people that have been raped, tortured, murdered. 10,000 have been affected, and no single person, be other than the Marcoses,
All right.
have been blamed for this. I think that is a problem. It is so convenient to generalize and depend on this whole narrative of command responsibility.
Mr.
And then at the end of the day, we're still looking for the truth.
All right.
So when are we going to end this?
All
So I
right.
think that is what is hijacking
Okay.
the dynamics of this whole complex period of our history. That we rest on this very convenient narrative.
I got your
Everything
point.
contained on one hand.
Let me include Mr. Haidarian. Mr. Haidarian, you've just listened to what Mr. Contreras is saying, basically that let's look for the truth. And it's quite interesting that some of the victims of Marcos, particularly the Aquino family, Corazon and her son became president later, and nothing has been genuinely done to put an end to the divide and the wounds that have sort of beset the society for almost now 3 decades.
Well, I mean, first of all, let's talk about facts, not just narratives. There is already a law called the Marcos Compensation Act, which clearly says that there were human rights violations during the martial law period, and people who were tortured during that period are entitled to compensation from the funds that were retrieved from the Marcoses over the past few decades. The other issue is also there are clear facts. You know, there's a very clear literature. The World Bank, leading universities, leading academics have clearly proven that not only in terms of human rights violation, you also had huge economic damage caused to the country. $28 billion of debt from only $300 million, a growth rate of only 1.4%, a huge level of depreciation in Philippine currency from 6 pesos to 20 pesos. So there's a lot of facts and data out there for people to check. But the interesting thing to keep in mind is that surveys show, again, majority of Filipinos want to move on. For them, there should be forgiveness. And as the previous speaker mentioned, maybe it's time for a move to the next chapter. That's the view of a lot of Filipino people. And I think that is where we have to ask ourselves a question. In the last 3 decades, the presidents who came after Marcos, what did they do in order to instill a strong sense of truth and respect for facts among people? A lot of people believe that the previous presidents did not do enough for people to appreciate the atrocities of the past administration. And not to mention, there's a lot of autocratic nostalgia in the Philippines. People are sick and tired of the recent presidents that they have had. So a lot of them are trying to think, or some of them are beginning to think that perhaps the Marcos times was a better time when there was law and order and better infrastructure. I think it's corruption and incompetence of previous president that has made a lot of Filipinos more forgiving towards the Marcos regime and has brought back this autocratic nostalgia to the Philippines. I think that is a bigger question that we have to focus on.
Let me go back to Mr. Renato Reyes. Supporters of former President Marcos say that it's not fair to just come and say that his rule was repressive, because if you have to look at the context, then there was the Moro rebellion, communist insurgency, the rise of the radical leftist groups. So you have to take all that into account.
Well, actually, those are just used as scapegoats. Those are just used as a justification for extending his rule beyond the constitutional limit. So what he did was to establish a dictatorship. It wasn't out of his desire to protect the people from any rebellion. It was out of his desire to cling on to power indefinitely for the rest of his life. So that is something that has been established, and that's why the people rose up in 1986. Now, people will say past governments have not done enough to hold the Marcos family accountable to stop them from returning to power. That may be true, but it does not justify the present government for committing an even bigger mistake of honoring the dictator and aiding in the whitewashing of his crimes. It's time that we tell the youth, the young people, what really happened, and it's time to tell them that we have to keep on campaigning and keep on protesting and keep on moving to stop the return of the Marcoses, because we are pretty sure this does not end with the burial. This will go on until the Marcos family are back in Malacanang, until they're back in the highest seats of power. So it's only the people who stand in their way, and that's what we aim to do from now in the coming months. That's what we want to campaign on.
Mr. Contreras, do you think that President Duterte will face a crisis in the coming days, particularly knowing that some of his allies, Vice President Leni Robredo and many others, distancing themselves from the decision to give Marcos a hero's burial?
Well, I have no doubt that the president, as I said, he will abide by what is legal and what is the law. Issues about the Marcoses coming back to power is an issue that has to be left to the electorate to decide, for the democratic process to decide. And all the parties are free to express their opinions and mobilize against or for a particular issue. The left is not prevented from moving that the Marcoses should no longer be allowed, but you could not have a law to prevent them from coming back to power. It has to be through the democratic process. If majority of the Filipinos will decide in the future to vote them back to power, despite allegations, despite the activism and the mobilization by the left and the anti-Marcos forces, then so be it. Because at the end of the day, we can keep on debating, but it should be the rule of law. The problem is the country is facing so many problems. How do we? I don't want to use the word move on because I think that's politically charged. But what are the next steps? Where do we go from here?
Okay.
Are we going to be divided until the end of time?
Well, basically,
are we going to what is exactly the point when you say prevent the Marcoses from coming back to power? What is exactly the plan?
all right, I got your point. This is exactly what Duterte was basically saying that the decision is basically to heal the nation and unify the nation. Mr. Haydarian, do you think that this is something that could potentially in the near future bridge the gap and heal the wounds?
Well, forgiveness, of course, is something that is ingrained in the Filipino culture, in the Philippine Catholic culture. But for the opponents of the Marcoses, they believe that forgiveness should come in light of memory. It should not come in light of whitewashing of what happened in the past. But I think the political reality is that President Duterte at this point is extremely popular. His numbers are around 70 to 80%, depending on what surveys you're looking at. The Senate and the Philippine Congress are very much behind the president, and the Supreme Court in a 9-5 split sided also with the president. So the Philippine state apparatus is on the side of President Duterte, and public opinion, it seems 60% of the people according to surveys are on the side of President Duterte. So I think in many ways this is the political reality that opponents of the burial of the Marcos as a national hero should take into consideration. Again, we can debate whether this was technically a national hero burial or not, but he got military salutation during his burial, and he is in the cemetery of national heroes. That says a lot. But the reality is that law and the political momentum is on the side of President Duterte.
Mr. Reyes, what is it that which you would like to achieve? Revoke the decision about Marcos, or push the nation to reconsider the whole legacy of the Marcos era?
Well, I think it's time for the president to also listen to the people protesting in the streets. The people do not wish for this burial. They do not support a Marcos-Duterte alliance, and they would want the Marcoses to be held accountable finally for all the crimes that they did. So you see, their ill-gotten wealth, that it remains with them. Now, they have been able to worm their way back to power. These are all legitimate issues, and these are what the people are protesting here in the streets. No? So we hope that the president would take time to listen to these sentiments, because we think that he grossly underestimated the public reaction, the backlash, the protest that came after the hero's burial or after the interment of Marcos in the libingan ng mga bayani. So it is time for the president to listen and understand where the deep resentment is coming from when it comes to the Marcos issue.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Mr. Reyes, Mr. Contreras, and Mr. Haydarian, thank you very much indeed for your time.